focus on the main points rather than on some of the details that I would otherwise have commented on. Nevertheless, you may feel bludgeoned, so forgive me for that. I will try to end my main presentation by about 1 o'clock so that there can be some time for discussion in case you can stay thereafter. So as Pratap indicated, I've been working for some time on a rather large project with a group of collaborators, in particular Arjun Jayadev, who's at the University of Massachusetts but about to join the Azim Premji University, and Rahul Lahoti, who's in the University of Göttingen at present, to develop a database of consumption and income around the world. And what we have done, as I will briefly describe, is to collect as much data as we can from primarily at this stage secondary data sets, but also from our own work at trying to investigate various primary data sources that might have been overlooked, something we hope to continue and extend over time. And we've tried to do this for as many countries in the world as we can, now more than 150, and for as long a period as we can. And that extends currently from about 1960 to the present. We believe this is, at this point, the most comprehensive such data source that exists, and it's also one which we think has a certain degree of consistency and also transparency, which the other data sources don't have in this area of looking at consumption and income, not only across but also within countries. And let me also note that although many people have approached these sorts of international comparisons, which pool household surveys, from the vantage point of a concern with inequality, which is certainly something that does greatly interest us, and of course also with a concern for poverty, the purposes to which this database can be put are various. And we have very much in mind, for example, the analysis of inclusivity of growth and development within countries, regions, and indeed the entire world, but also various other sorts of comparisons of living standards and the provision of data for diverse explanatory purposes. So you'll get more of an indication of what I have in mind as we proceed, or what it is that it's possible to do. Now, Ratin gave me a wonderful suggestion yesterday when I happened to meet him, being the excellent student of human nature that he is, that I ought not to bludgeon you with data, and that I should instead reduce my presentation to two main ideas. The first is that we have a data set, and the second is that we can learn things from it. And in particular, he suggested that I present a few things that we could learn from it that you wouldn't otherwise have known or might not otherwise have known. So this is the first Ratin Roy proposition, which is that we have a data set, our research group, but you will too, because our goal is to make this publicly available, along with as much documentation as we can provide. That has been our goal from the beginning when we started work on this project 6 years ago. We intend for it to be a global public good. We invite public participation in various ways of specialists as well as the general public in helping us to understand how the data can be improved. And we hope to make as transparent as possible all of the steps in the construction of the data, so that those who wish to draw on the universe of data we have constructed but make their own choices as to how to develop the final product which they use in analysis will be able to do that, which is something that has not been possible until now. This public release will, we hope, happen in an early form in about 2 months' time. Okay, in an initial form, beta form, as the techies like to say, right? So I've already said something about what the project is about. There are two data sets which are at the heart of the project, the global consumption data set and the global income data set. And this is very important to understand. Surveys of material living standards come in one or the other form, typically. There are very few surveys in the world that survey households both with respect to consumption and income. And pooling data on consumption and income together can lead to misleading conclusions, as I will try to give you at least one example of later, but there are various illustrations of this. So what we have tried to do is to estimate consumption distributions where we have only income distributions, or vice versa, to try to avoid some of these problems. The sort of pooling that is done and that we believe is, or I've just suggested is inappropriate, is pervasive. And for example, the World Bank's PovCalNet database uses a pooled approach of this kind, as does Branko Milanovic in his well-known work on inequality. Now, in addition to constructing the data, and of course you can use the data in a pooled form if you like, but in addition to constructing the data and placing it in these two different sub databases for consumption and for income, we have developed a set of analytical tools which we use for various purposes. For instance, for filling in missing data, because there isn't a survey for every year in every country. So we do rely on interpolation and extrapolation. We try to be as careful as possible in doing that, and I won't bore you with the details at this point, but we have some tools for doing that which we believe are reasonable ones. We have some tools for identifying outliers in the data, which once identified we strip out or otherwise adjust. And we have some tools for creating portraits of aggregates of countries, or indeed jurisdictions or regions. So for example, if there are separate surveys for a rural and urban area, or separate reports of the quantile means, which is to say the level of consumption or income which is enjoyed by different portions of the population in a rural or urban area, we can aggregate these to construct a national portrait. We can also construct portraits for entire regions, for instance, distributions for South Asia or for Sub-Saharan Africa, or for arbitrary groupings of countries, for the G20 or for the BRICS, which we have done. And you can choose your own, because we will make these tools available as well. Okay. Some sample applications to track historical and contemporary evolution of living standards. Develop these descriptions of aggregates and decompose changes into within country and between country components or other such analyses of that sort. We can calculate any measure of poverty, inequality, living standards, inclusivity of growth and development using the basic underlying data on how income and consumption is distributed in the population. Because what we do is we construct what we call a synthetic population, which is essentially a model of the real population in every country and in every year. So one simple way to think about what we have done is to construct a model population for the entire world, where we have one representative for each portion of a population in each country and in each year, where the portions of the population are ranked according to income in that country. So in effect, you will be able to download onto your computer an entire model population of the world from 1960 to the present and to analyze it yourself. Of course, this could be very useful for explanatory as well as descriptive analyses. Economists love to do regression analyses and other such things using variables either as something to be explained or as explanatory factors, and there's a universe of data of this kind that could be constructed. For example, in political economy analyses in economics, many people believe that the ratio of the median to the mean income is important. This is something that has figured in a lot of analyses. The idea is that if the mean income is higher than the median, well, it's always higher than the median, but if in one scenario the ratio of the mean to the median is higher than in another, one might expect certain things to happen from a political economy point of view. For instance, for there to be a greater demand for redistribution. This has been a prominent idea in the literature. But there often isn't data on the median of the income distribution. And we can construct that, an estimate of the median of the income distribution for every country and year from 1960 to the present. And of course, forecasting and nowcasting, which means determining the situation now, given that there's a data lag. If we have growth data for countries, we can move forward on the basis of certain assumptions, the distribution that distributional information which we have from within countries, to present a portrait of how the distribution in a given country, region, or the world as a whole is likely to evolve over time. Nowcasting is necessary because, as I've mentioned very often, the last survey we have for a country is 3, 5, 7 years ago. And so, in effect, if we want to construct a portrait for today, for 2015, we will have to rely on assumptions of one kind or another. Right, so because of lack of time, I'm not going to go into the invidious comparisons between our data set and others, but suffice it to say there are comparisons to be made, and I will be happy to go back to this issue later on. But I do think that we have a more comprehensive and higher quality database than others that are present. These are some summary statistics. I won't bludgeon you with them, nor will I bludgeon you with the detailed description of exactly how we construct the database, given the lack of time. But there are a number of stages which are involved that come down to collating surveys from as many sources as possible and then putting them in comparable terms. And there are various choices to be made at each of these stages, which could be controversial, and that's precisely why we want to be transparent about what we have done. The benchmark versions of the database that I'm going to describe to you are largely defined in 2005 purchasing power parity terms, unless I tell you otherwise. There's one point at which I will refer to market exchange rates, okay, which is to say that they're meant to refer to comparable levels of purchasing power of persons across the world. Our approach is promiscuous in the sense that we're not promiscuous in any other respect, but in the sense that we are really quite happy to draw on data from any source at all, in principle. Okay. But until now, we've drawn on secondary data sources primarily, as I mentioned. Maybe I should just say one word about this. Total number of surveys, 1,559, but this is something that is continuously developing, and they're from all parts of the world, all decades. So of course, the density of surveys changes over time and becomes higher, in particular, over time. Okay. All right, so skip all this. Some things we didn't know. Ratin Roy Proposition 2, or know better now. Okay. Many of you will be aware, how much time have I taken up? Okay. Many of you will be aware that there is a debate in India, there has been for quite a number of years, about whether the National Sample Survey is adequate for capturing the level of material living standards, in particular because of the gap which is visible in the data between what appear to be estimates of consumption in the NSS and estimates of consumption deriving from national income and product accounts. Angus Deaton, among others, the Nobel Prize winner in economics this year, has been very concerned with this specific issue, and different people have suggested different routes to resolving this problem, with some people, such as Surjit Balla, suggesting that one should use the national income account-based information alone, which would lead to much higher estimates of people's consumption and income. Now, I want to show you that this problem is global. It's not just Indian. This has been understood to some extent, but now I think we can understand it much better. This is a graph of GDP per capita on the horizontal axis and of the survey mean on the vertical axis. Each dot represents a survey from a country year. This is pooled across the entire database. Now, there are two arms, as you can see, a lower arm and an upper arm. Now, if the GDP per capita had been exactly the same as the survey mean, then the dots would be on the 45-degree line, right in the middle. But you'll see that none of the dots are, right? And most of them are on the lower arm. So what that means is that in most country years, the estimates of the level of consumption, which are provided by survey means, are lower than those of GDP per capita, and typically about a third lower. You'll see that there's a slope that appears to roughly characterize this lower arm. But then there are these countries on the upper arm too. And I think it's an important and interesting research program to figure out why there are discrepancies in both directions. Some people would say the discrepancies ought not to perturb us because there are differences in concepts used, but that doesn't seem to explain the entirety of the difference. So this is one thing to come out of the data, which ought to be of interest. It does suggest that we need to think hard about whether surveys everywhere are correctly measuring advantage or not. But it may be that relative comparisons across countries are less affected by that problem than our characterizations of the absolute level of advantage in any given country. Okay. Now, here's a second proposition. Using consistent methods and concepts can change our conclusions. And as I have mentioned, we try to use consistent methods and concepts. We also try to be as much as possible, as I mentioned, transparent about data choices. Both of these go together. Now this is a global example, not an Indian one. Very often people have argued that Latin America, or they have thought, that Latin America is the highest inequality region in the world. That used to be a so-called stylized fact, even though it was recognized that there were other countries and places where there was high inequality as well. For instance, it has always been recognized that South Africa was a high inequality country. But broadly, the characterization had been that Latin America is the highest inequality region. However, we find that that's reversed in our data set. Once we estimate consumption from income distributions, or vice versa, this is from our income database. So we have estimated income distributions from consumption distributions in countries where we have only consumption distributions. Now, of course, inequality of income tends to be greater than inequality of consumption because, generally speaking, the more affluent save a larger proportion of their income, or putting it complementarily, they consume a smaller proportion of their income. Now, Latin America generally has income surveys, and Sub-Saharan Africa generally has consumption surveys. So, if one doesn't make the adjustment, one is comparing a type of survey for which inequality is typically lower, and is found typically in Sub-Saharan Africa, with a type of survey for which inequality is typically higher, and which are found typically in Latin America. Once one makes the adjustment, one finds that Sub-Saharan Africa actually has higher inequality than Latin America. And this is visible in various indicators. Here I've shown you the income share of the top 10% based on surveys alone. And that's a very crucial point, which I must emphasize. This is, I suppose, as good a point as any for me to make a remark about that. We also know that in India, and indeed around the world, it's very likely that household surveys do not adequately sample the rich. And there are many reasons for this, from pure randomness, which is that, for example, it's very unlikely that Mukesh Ambani's house is going to be chosen randomly by a surveyor, and there are more rigorous ways in which I can put this, involving the properties of small samples and so forth. But it's extremely unlikely that that's going to happen. That's one reason. But there are other reasons. It may be that, for example, the surveyor is likely to be intimidated or turned back when knocking on doors in certain kinds of households, and so on and so forth. So it is generally accepted that there's undersurveying of the affluent, especially the very rich. And this is one reason for some skepticism about survey data in general. Okay. Now, oh yes, where was I? Okay. There are widely divergent patterns of inclusivity of growth. There's been a concern with inclusivity of growth, of course, in India and in countries around the world, and as I will show you, with good reason. Because which countries promote the living standards of all and which do not does seem to have some systematic aspects. Again, this is something to be researched further. I'm going to give you illustrations of this thought. First of all, let us simply note that inequality has increased, relative inequalities now between people, a great deal in a number of countries in the world. This is China, this big circle here. On the x-axis, we have the income Gini coefficient, a measure of inequality in 1980. On the y-axis, we have the Gini coefficient in 2010. If the Gini coefficient had not changed, the dots would be on the red line. But it has changed, which is why the dots are off of the red line. And as you will see, this purple line is the line of best fit, a regression line which reflects the average relationship between these two. On the left-hand side of this intersection between the red line and the purple line, therefore, you have quite a number of observations in which inequality is increased. China being the most extraordinary case in this respect. India, according to the survey data, has not had inequality that's much increased, but as I have just noted, we have reason to be suspicious that the survey data may not capture everything, especially with respect to inequality. Usually I use an example from Sao Paulo, from Brazil, where billionaires fly helicopters from building to building to avoid the traffic. And I think that those billionaires are probably not being adequately surveyed in Brazil, in India, and elsewhere. But nevertheless, it's notable that India's inequality on this measure has not much increased. You have a number of countries, if we go into it, it's quite interesting, quite a few of them are European countries, which had low inequality to start with and have had increasing or rising inequality over time for various reasons, including policy reforms they've undertaken, possibly effects of globalization and so on. And you have countries with high inequality where it's decreased over time. A number of those are in sub-Saharan Africa for whatever reason. Turns out that just about 50% of the observations are on either side of this picture. But of course, the share of the world population living in countries where inequality has risen is much higher. It's more like 2/3. And moreover, where inequality has increased, it's more than compensated for where it's decreased. So this is average within country inequality, weighted and unweighted, and in both cases you'll see that it's increased over time. Okay. Now this is a graph for what we call fast-growing countries. The fast-growing countries are the 15 countries with the highest growth rates. Between 2000 and 2010, we could have chosen a different period, and perhaps we should have. But for purpose of this analysis, we chose those 15 countries. And what this graph shows you is the compound annualized growth rate in percentage terms experienced by different percentiles of the population, from poorest to richest. Now this line, which is at the top, the blue line, corresponds to China. So what it means is that, rather unambiguously, everyone gained, but the poorer you were, the less you gained in China. So even the poorest people for whom it's possible for us to make an estimate, the first percentile, gained at a compound annual growth rate of consumption of 1.5% or so per capita, I believe that is. Certainly it is. And on the right, as you go toward the 100th percentile, you see that it approaches 8%. So there's a very considerable difference in the growth rate experienced by different parts of the population in China, which of course is what accounts for the rising inequality within China. And there's a rural to urban dimension of this, as well as intra-urban and an intra-rural dimension, of course. Now for the other fast-growing countries, you see something different, right? They're all within this band, more or less. And there are variations among them, but there's no story as dramatic as China's. India's is the orange line. I'm afraid it's not terribly visible. It's near the bottom. And you'll see that it looks like a relatively gentle, even flat graph. So those who think that India has had a relatively good experience in this respect, and I'm not sure that it has when one does an all things considered assessment, but those who wanted to argue that could point to this comparison. Okay, now I want to show you some other graphs, and there are quite a few, so I'll run through them quickly, which also bear on the inclusivity of growth from our data. These are graphs which we constructed with the help of The Economist. They're going to do a special insert on the G20, for which they want to do an analysis of income distribution. And they also want to create an online application which will allow users, readers, to enter their own income and to identify where they stand relative to the G20 distribution. This is a graph for the United States. Now, each of these lines represent the trajectory over time of the per capita income experienced at a given percentile of the population. And in particular, they're ordered here from the first through actually, let me restate that. This is the 10th percentile, the 20th, 30th, 40th, 50th, 60th, 70th, 80th, and 90th. And then this is the 95th, and this is the 99th, as given by surveys. So you can see here that the 10th percentile is almost a flat line. And that's pretty much true for the other percentiles. 20th, 30th, 40th, 50th, 60th. You start to see a little bit of an increase around the 60th or 70th. But it's a very gentle one. The 80th and the 90th experience much more notable increases. Once you go to the 95th and the 99th, you have real gains. So this is the fabled median income stagnation in the United States, that not much has changed. In fact, you could take this picture back to 1970 and not much would have changed. And there are other ways of capturing this lack of inclusivity of the growth that's taking place in the United States. And remember again that this 99% percentile figure is from surveys alone. And if one were to use other kinds of data, as Piketty, Saez, and others have done from tax records, etc., one would find much higher absolute levels of income and consumption for the top percentile, and also higher rates of increase from what we so far have been able to determine based on our own comparisons. Not surprisingly at all. Okay. Now compare the United States with the United Kingdom. Here, you don't really have stagnation at the bottom. Although it looks as if there is a fairly monotonically increasing rate of increase. That is to say, as you look at richer and richer percentiles, the rate at which they have improved their income appears, at least visually, to have improved or to have increased. And so there is a certain sort of a bias which is present there in terms of who has gained. Nevertheless, it seems as if everyone has gained. So the UK picture is rather different from the US picture. But as in the United States, the 90th, 95th, and 99th percentiles, according to the survey data, have gained much more. And maybe I could just say a word on politics there. This is perhaps one of the reasons that the new labor discourse of trying to facilitate aggregate growth, but using the benefits of growth for the benefit of the population as a whole, was moderately successful politically.
This is income, right?
This is income, actually, yes, you're right. Okay, Germany, and this is typical for European countries. You see a similar picture elsewhere. Widening inequalities as well, increases, but fairly modest ones for the lower percentiles. Russia, a period where there were decreases, of course, after the collapse of communism, followed by recovery for all, but most especially for the better off. I should mention, by the way, I'm terribly sorry. This dashed line is the Gini coefficient. Okay. So let's just go back so you can see the progression of the dashed line. For the United States, it almost doesn't change. Light blue, dashed line. For the UK, it actually, funnily enough, shows an increase and then appears even to show a slight decrease. That's a bit of a surprise to us. Germany, relatively stagnant. The Gini coefficient is a sluggish measure of inequality. Russia, sharp increase and then a modest decrease. India, almost no change in the Gini coefficient. But you can see visually how there have been increases that have been differentially distributed as well. Once again, the proverbial rising tide raising all boats is evident here, or it's actually present here, but in very radically different measures for different groups, with a bias in favor of the rich. Even if in aggregate that doesn't really show much of an increase in relative inequalities. And China. China, again, the most dramatic story. Now, in China, you have very sharp increases in living standards, improvements in living standards on the lower end, alongside these increases, the increases in inequality. Indonesia, I would say broadly a similar picture to India, somewhere between India and China, but closer to India. Relative inequality is not showing a sharp increase, but differential gains certainly. Okay. Mexico, Brazil. Okay. Actually, maybe just very quickly on Mexico and Brazil. In Latin America, it has been much vaunted that there has been a decrease in inequality in recent years, and that has been put down to various sources, in particular government programs, social transfers of various kinds, minimum wage increases, and so on. That's to an extent evident here. You see the collapse in incomes due to structural adjustment to a degree, and then a substantial recovery with inequality decreasing in recent years, and similarly in Brazil, even more markedly in Brazil. Okay, now I want to focus on two countries that are manufacturing countries that have experienced fairly robust growth and have had a moderately positive experience in this respect. Turkey, okay, you can see again relatively flat inequality, and South Korea. South Korea is really a fantastic story, which should be better known. You have decreases in the Gini coefficient at the same time that you have broad-based growth, benefiting almost everyone, though again, the higher up you are to start with, the more you are benefiting, it seems. But of course, it should be remembered that these are absolute numbers here, not relative numbers on the right-hand side, so one has to be careful in interpreting the gains. Okay. The world income distribution has changed, especially after 1990, but mainly because of China's per capita growth. Okay. If you look at the picture from 1960 to 1990, not much changes. After 1990 is when the real action takes place, and it is very considerably due to China. Between 1990 and 2000, almost entirely due to China. After 2000, other countries join the club, start to make more of an impact on the world distribution. But still, it's a China story. This is a portrait of the world consumption distribution. I could have equally drawn one for income. And it's decomposed by region. So this was the world consumption distribution in 1990, and it shows the density of the population at different levels of 2005 purchasing power parity dollars. This is a constant level of consumption in purchasing power terms. There are problems with these PPPs, which I myself have discussed in other work, but nevertheless we use them here because we have to use something. This is a log scale, meaning it's highly deceptive, because the gaps along the axis, the same gaps along the axis represent larger and larger differences in dollar terms as you go to the right. So if you were not to use a log scale but use a regular scale, the world income distribution and consumption distribution would look much less equal than this looks. That's a very important point to keep in mind. I could show you later on, if you wish, if I can find one, a graph which is not scaled in this way. The reason we do this is so that it's easier to view. Because if you stretch it out, it will look extremely difficult. It will be extremely difficult to view because you'll have to have a very long axis indeed. Now, I would just like to, at this point, mention a personal bugbear of mine. When people talk of middle-income countries, that is a somewhat propagandistic concept, because the countries that are supposed to be middle income are not middle income at all once you remove the log scale, because the high income countries have so much higher in income than the middle income countries in relative and in absolute terms that it does raise the question of whether they're middle income at all. And this also bears upon the question of the size of the global middle class, which has been much vaunted, because in fact the so-called global middle class in countries such as India and China, and we'll talk about this a bit more later, actually has relatively low purchasing power for the most part by developed country standards and global standards. So in what sense it's really middle class is a very serious question. We have a separate paper on that. Now, I'd like you to focus on the purple area for East Asia, which is East Asia and the Pacific. In 1990, there were two humps in this purple area at the bottom. This is, roughly speaking, China's population and the population of other low-income countries in East Asia. This is the set of high-income countries in East Asia, Japan, and of course, to some degree, Taiwan, South Korea, and so on. By 2010, on the right-hand side, there's only one hump. That's because the Chinese population has moved to the right. It's become richer, so you no longer see two humps, you see one hump. And that's also to some extent changed the slight double-humpedness of the world consumption distribution and made it more single-humped over time. Okay? It's basically an East Asia story, China moving to the right. And there are many different ways of addressing this. This is the global consumption distribution in 1990, China, India, and the rest of the world. The lines on top are their medians. So the green line is China's median consumption in 1990. Red line is India's median consumption in 1990. And the blue line is the rest of the world median consumption in 1990. Now, as you see, China's is slightly lower than India's in terms of the median. Rest of the world considerably higher, but that incorporates poor and rich countries in the rest of the world. Now, what happens between 1990 and 2010 is that China moves ahead a lot, 281% increase in the median. The green line moves from just above the bell to where it is here. India's only 12%, I'm sorry, 36%. India's only 36%. Rest of the world only 12%. So yes, India's median increase is higher than the rest of the world, but not as dramatically so. Global consumption inequality, using a different indicator of inequality, the tile index, which we use here because it just makes it visually a little bit more clear what's happening. For the world as a whole, the world excluding China, the world excluding India, and the world excluding China and India. And as I mentioned, we have these aggregation tools which make it easy for us to do this sort of analysis, which might otherwise be harder to do. So you'll see at the top, the blue line, the world as a whole experienced decreasing inequality. This is mainly due to China's increase and due to the decrease in inter-country inequalities. I'll show you later as well. The world excluding India, but keeping China in, has pretty much the same trajectory. That's the green line. The world excluding China, but keeping India in, actually has increasing inequality up to a point and then slightly decreasing inequality. And the world excluding China and India, similarly so. Okay, so it's really China that's driving the whole story again. For the tile index, and for other indexes, in this case, slight variation, we can actually explicitly decompose income inequality into the between-country and within-country components. And we do this here for different years, from 1960 to the present. You'll see that over time, the between-country component of inequality globally, global interpersonal inequality, has been falling from 78 to 57%. And that's basically because of this giant mass of people, in particular in China, becoming richer between 1990 and 2010. Not much movement. Almost none between 1960 and 1980. Modest movement between 1980 and 1990. Big movement after that. And I won't go into this further, but almost all of the 90 to 2000 changes is China, and after that is, again, other countries play a smaller role. The relative position of countries have changed. This is the top third of fast-growing countries. Here we're showing the percentile in a country's distribution relative to the percentile in the world distribution. So, for example, for India, which is this, I'm sorry, unfortunately it's the least visible line here, this turquoise line. If you were to take the median, the 50th percentile, it appears at around the 22nd percentile of the world distribution. Okay, so that means the person for whom half the population was richer and half poorer in India in 2010 fell into at the 22nd percentile worldwide, meaning 78% of people were richer. Now China has moved up a lot, as you'll see over time, if you compare the 1990 and 2010 graphs. India has moved down modestly in relative terms, because it is relative when you're calculating percentiles. That's because of all the Chinese who've moved ahead of India. And the picture is even more dramatic in other countries. If you look at the India-Nigeria comparison, I haven't included it here, it's quite dramatic that Nigeria was more or less above India, a substantial part of the Nigerian distribution, in 1970 and 80, and now it's much below. And of course, even further behind China. Poverty in the world, excluding India and China, one by one or together. Similarly, you'll find that it's a China story. World poverty as a whole falling. This is at the $1.25 line, which I don't have much faith in, but there it is, 2005 PPP. But when you remove China and India, the orange line, much more modest rate of decrease. When you remove India but leave China in, the pattern, the global pattern remains pretty much unchanged because China is driving it. When you remove China but leave India in, you have a decrease, but it's mainly in the later period that it happens when India starts to grow more quickly. Okay.
Sanjay, just a quick
Sure.
please go back to the previous one because there's a big increase in, as you said, the increase in China, the distribution is pretty lower, increase at the bottom was pretty small, right? Now,
This is head count.
yeah, this is right. So, but what I'm surprised by is the fact that China is still driving a lot after 2000, because by then I am not expecting too many Chinese to be below the 125 level, and therefore Chinese growth would be inframarginal in the sense that it shouldn't really be affecting too many people.
Okay,
right?
good point. There are other fast-growing countries that enter after 2000. Sub-Saharan Africa has robust growth. Commodities boom is taking place. Latin America has robust growth. All of that is also influencing the rate of reduction after you remove China. And you're right. The fact that the total headcount in China has fallen means that in an ongoing way, China can only contribute less and does contribute less. Now, that was at a low poverty line. If you move to a higher poverty line, $4.16, which we picked for certain reasons, that it happens to correspond to a certain calculation of adequate nourishment, which we did, though it's also quite problematical for other reasons, you find a much less dramatic picture of poverty reduction in all of these scenarios. And when you take out China, you actually have an increase in the headcount ratio between 1980 and 2010. Okay. And when you take out China and India, that becomes even more dramatic. That's the headcount ratio, the proportion of poor people. The absolute number of poor people has quite significantly increased at these higher poverty lines. This is something you won't hear from many people, but there it is. Okay. Another thought. How much time do we have left?
I think another 5 minutes or so.
Oh my goodness. Relative income gains may have been smaller, but absolute income gains larger for the global affluent. Okay, I've already shown you a graph previously involving the percentile gains for different groups within a country. This is for the world as a whole. Now, it's interesting that it's hump-shaped. This is basically because of China. The Chinese are gaining a lot. The Chinese population as a whole, they're experiencing a high growth rate, and they fall in a certain middle portion of the world distribution. The rich countries have low growth rates in this period, and so the cumulative growth rates on the right-hand side being experienced by the relatively rich are small. Yet, the absolute gains being experienced by people in the rich countries are much higher. Why is that? It's very simple. Even if you're experiencing a very low growth rate, if that low growth rate is being applied to a very high base, then you're going to experience absolute gains which are very high too, potentially, relative to those who are experiencing high growth rate from a much lower base. And on the basis of our calculations, this is going to continue to increase this gap, the absolute gap between the currently rich countries and the so-called middle-income countries, let alone the poor countries, well into the middle of this century, even in an optimistic scenario. Okay, very quickly, two more things. We have very little time, and these are both important, so let me head through them quickly. Fast-growing countries are a more useful category than the BRICS. The BRICS were, as you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, a media concoction. Turns out they don't explain very much from the point of view of understanding the global distribution. If we take the 15 fastest growing countries between 1990 and 2010, and we look at their distribution and how it changes, that's the blue line in 1990, the green line in 2010. It's moved to the right. It will turn out again, China is central to that. The world, excluding the fast-growing countries, hardly moved. When we add the BRICS, it changes almost nothing. I won't go through this in detail, just to show you visually. The BRICS graph is pretty much overlapping the fast-growing countries graph. And that's not because the BRICS have similar behavior. It's because they have a couple of common members, and most especially China. Okay. Now this is my last and most important point. China has entered the core of the world economy in one important sense. India and indeed other countries are nowhere near doing so. Okay, this is the really crucial point. If you take away one thing from this, please take away this from today's presentation. Okay. Now, many years ago, Lance Taylor, an economist, wrote an article with a Brazilian collaborator, which was actually about Brazil, where they used the concept of Bel-India, Belgium within India. Okay. Nowadays, it looks more like we have an Ital-India, an Italy within India, or maybe a Euro-India, Europe within India. Essentially, they were interested in the question of people with high levels of purchasing power in poor countries and the impact that had on the poor countries' dynamics, but also on global dynamics. Now, China is a landmark case in world history of a country which still has relatively modest per capita income, but has a sizable number of people who occupy increasingly the upper middle and even the upper reaches of the world income and consumption distribution. Think of, if you've ever been there, the Louis Vuitton store in Paris or something similar, where there are lots of Chinese customers to be seen on any given day, and the store has hired Chinese staff in order to deal with them. You won't find so many Indians. Not that there aren't rich Indians, but you're not going to find them contributing to the footfall in the Louis Vuitton store. And that's something very, very important. China is driving global demand today in a way that no other developing country does. Okay. Now, there's very little time to go into any of these details, if any. But let me just point out on this graph, which shows the percentage of the population in different countries that are in the world's top 10 or top 20%, and how that's changed over time. That in China, in 1990, it was almost no one, according to the survey data. By 2010, it's moved up to 5.4% in the top 10% and 21.9% in the top 20% of the world distribution. India is still almost nowhere, essentially zero, both in 1990 and 2010. This is according to the survey data, and you may mistrust the survey data. Again, it's not that there aren't rich Indians. It's not that one can't see with one's own eyes all the consumption that's taking place in India. I do believe the survey data understates what's going on in India. But nevertheless, this is a dramatic difference. Okay. Now, I'm going to very quickly just, if I may, show you one last thing. There are different ways we could classify countries according to their centrality in the world system: political, cultural, social, military, and economic. And among the economic, there are different criteria we can use. Here are some. Whether the per capita income is above a certain threshold, whether the share of world economic activity of a given country, the total population's consumption or income, for instance, as a share of the world consumption or income, reaches a certain threshold, whether the proportion of the population of a country with income above a certain threshold is high or not, and itself reaches a certain threshold, whether the proportion of the world population with income above a certain threshold is contributed by a given country. And this is the most important and new factor in the world economic system. This is what China is doing that no other country has done before, only because it's both populous and getting rich. Both. No other country has been able to do that. Okay. So operational criteria could be defined in various ways. I'm going to just show you one of these. Let's take $6,000 of per capita survey income. So for a family of four, that would be $24,000, okay, at market exchange rates. So we can ask the question, does the country have a per capita income above that level? We can ask the question, is 5% of world economic activity or more, world consumption or income, made up by that country's contribution? We can ask the question, does 50% of the population in the country have income which is above $6,000? We can ask the question, does 5% of the world population with income above $6,000 come from that country? Now, if we do that, how do I move this? There we go. Okay. If we do that, we find a very interesting scenario. Okay, this is the size of the economy in 2010. On this criterion, only 4 countries qualified as belonging to the core. We have similar criteria for semi-periphery as opposed to periphery. I won't go into them, but they're much more modest, involving a $3,000 threshold and 1% or 3% rather than 5%. That's 2010, and there has been a change over time. Okay, China is clearly in the core according to this criterion, as is Japan and Germany. But China wasn't in 1990, okay? Though Japan and Germany were, along with the United States. And India qualified, but only to a small degree, as belonging to the semi-periphery, as opposed to the periphery. Okay, tiny Singapore hadn't made it by this criterion yet. Switzerland was a member of the semi-periphery then, on that criterion. Okay? But in 1960, China and India were in a very similar position, and you have relative continuity between the two pictures, 60 and 90. Okay. I'm going to, because of lack of time, just jump to this. Share in the world's population with survey income above $6,000. Moderately high threshold. In 1960, way over there on the right-hand side, you had the United States with 50% of the population, roughly, having a level of survey income above this threshold in absolute and constant 2005 PPP terms. On the x-axis, we have the 1960 level. On the y-axis, we have the 2010 level. So the United States was in a scenario where, excuse me, I misstated. I shouldn't say 50% of the U.S. population. Rather, I meant the share of the world population. This is, and that's what is important for my purpose and our purpose. The share of the world population with income above $6,000 coming from the United States was 50%. Okay, so you can see the importance of the U.S. in that connection in 1960. By 2010, the share of the world population with that level of purchasing power as defined by survey income has come down to about 20%. Right? Germany has stayed above the threshold of 6,000 as well, along with the United States. But its contribution to the world population with income above that level has fallen, and also fallen as with the United States, but fallen more dramatically. Now, let me point to Japan and China. Now, Japan, between 1960 and 1990, had a quite successful development experience, and so the proportion of the world population with the relevant threshold of purchasing power coming from Japan moved up. Not a surprise. And now look at China. The truly dramatic case. From nowhere to 25% of the world population with this threshold of income. Now, if we raise the income standard or threshold higher, then China will disappear from that, at least if survey income is our guide. Because according to survey data alone, even the richest people in China start to drop off quite quickly once incomes are raised. But for this threshold, which is what matters for many purposes, and certainly for the locational decisions of companies and for understanding the drivers of world aggregate demand, China has become very important. India not. India remains in this box. I believe that I've pretty much run out of time, so I'm going to stop here with, if I may, just one very last visual. The world system in 3 years, 1960, 1990, and 2010. The core countries, if they qualify on any of the criteria I mentioned, they're considered core, right? In any one of the criteria will do, are shown in yellow. The semi-periphery countries are shown in orange, and the red country and the peripheral countries are shown in red. If it's white, that means we didn't have enough data to do the analysis. Okay, so this is for 1960. Not surprising, United States, Australia, certain Western and Northern European countries are in the core. What happens between 60 and 90 is that basically nothing, except that some southern and basically some southern European countries join the core. Okay, so Spain and Portugal are still part of the semi-periphery. Italy has joined the core. Argentina, for very particular reasons, has dropped off from semi-periphery to periphery, but basically almost nothing has changed between 1960 and 1990. Right? Russia we get data for, so we put it in. 2010. Here I'm going to toggle between 1990 and 2010. What happens? China joins the core. Basically, not much else happens. Some other minor variations. Spain and Portugal join the core, and Argentina goes back to the semi-periphery. Botswana joins the semi-periphery. But basically, almost no change. So if there's anything going on in the world economic system from this standpoint, it's that China has joined the club. I'm sorry for taking so long, but I'd be delighted to have discussion of any of these issues. You can find working papers of ours on gcip.info, and please look there for our forthcoming public data release as well.
Thanks.